Well, Howard, it's really quite a delight to be with you today, especially in such an eventful moment. I so much wish that we could be present for the Symphony of the Mind that Embassy Education is organizing in Vietnam today. And it's such a pleasure, to have you here. It's an honor to be able to talk with you. I imagine that you also would have wanted to be in Vietnam tonight in such a special moment.
Yes, all sorts of plans that we have had to be suspended. I hope only temporarily.
Good. All right. So, as you know, we are sort of closing this powerful event that seeks to really open our minds about what education could be in a country that is growing so fast, and a country where so many important opportunities exist for young Vietnamese children. I think that Vietnam is at a really tipping point in terms of how the country thinks about education, and it's really wonderful to have an opportunity to have seen young people expressing their dance, their singing, the full expression of what human beings can do. And nobody better than you, I believe. My teacher, my mentor, my friend for a long time to close this event. So I'm thinking we can have a conversation, mainly featuring some of your key ideas. And you've been in the world of education really broadly recognized for your canonical work on multiple intelligences. So I think that it would be really wonderful to perhaps help us understand, why you think, how do you think about intelligence and human potential? Perhaps what drove you to thinking about human potential in such an encompassing way? And why do you think it matters today?
Well, Veronica, good to see you as always. The honest answer to what got me to think about human potential explicitly is that this education school at Harvard, where I am, received a very large grant where we were asked to talk about the nature and realization of human potential. And I was a young researcher at the time, and I used that once in a lifetime opportunity to survey different fields of knowledge, social sciences, behavioral sciences, philosophy, natural sciences, and try to figure out what is the best way to think about human beings cognitively. That is, how do we think? What is our mind like? And when I began this study over 40 years ago, everybody in psychology believed that people were different in how smart they were, and we could tell how smart they were by giving them an IQ test, the test which was actually developed in France over a century ago. And my survey did not begin with an effort to dethrone a singular view of intelligence, but it yielded, on an empirical basis, the conclusion that there are at least 7 different ways in which people can be smart or not so smart. I now think there are more than 7, but the important point was to pluralize intellect. And intelligence tests are good at predicting who will do well in a certain kind of school. Perhaps we could say a Parisian school in 1905 when the test was invented. But the more schools are different than they were in that classical European tradition, and the more that we look outside of school at the range of occupations and hobbies and interests people we have, the more limited a singular notion of intelligence is. So then was born the theory of multiple intelligences. And even though I wrote it as a psychologist, thinking primarily about how my psychology colleagues would react to it, it really has had its biggest impact on education and really around the world. I can't speak for Vietnam specifically, but all over the world, there are people who have set up multiple intelligence schools, multiple intelligence museums, human relations departments, and businesses which pay attention to multiple intelligences. And of course, that was flattering. It got me a lot of trips to interesting places where I could talk about it. And I made one decision, which I think is worth emphasizing because it relates to what we're going to speak about later. I decided not to monetize multiple intelligences. I decided not to create kits, not to create tests, not to empower certain people to teach about it, but just to release it to the world. And the world has done that. And many things that people have done, I've liked, and many things people have done I thought were harmless. But there were some things that people did which I thought were quite harmful. And that led me to the second major enterprise of my later life, which is to pay attention to how ideas and practices are used. Mm-hmm. Because multiple intelligences, which sounds like a freeing or embodying or empowering thing, can be used to classify people and to say, Veronica, you're smart in one way, but you're dumb in 6 ways, and we're going to get rid of you. Or you're smart in 3 ways, but that can't be changed. And so in what we've come to call the Good Project, we've paid a lot of attention to how ideas and practices can be used well or not so well.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I have appreciated, thank you for that. One of the things that I have appreciated the most with your work on multiple intelligences is this idea that intelligence is developable, so to speak, that we learn to become smarter, we learn to become better, that intelligence is sort of a human potential that can be nurtured. And also that cultures and context really contribute to the nurturing of, these 3, those 5, or nurturing of the whole human being. And I think that's really very, very powerful, especially for a time of change.
I mean, you could have the greatest potential in the world to be a musician, but if you never were given an instrument and never sung to, that would be a complete mystery. I will say that life isn't fair, and some people have a greater genetic potential to be musical or athletic or a physicist or a poet, but anybody's intelligences can be enhanced if they're motivated, if they're well taught, and if this is something that the society cares about. I'll just give an example. 150 years ago, if you wanted to go to a college like Harvard, you had to pass a test in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. And nowadays we would sort of laugh at that. But on the other hand, probably if you aren't good at coding, coding, or at mathematics, it's much harder to get into Harvard. And the fact that you can learn a foreign language easily doesn't matter. So societies vary in what they value. And I think everybody who's going to be listening to this talk knows that there's much more attention being paid now to what are called soft skills. And this is more the realm of personal intelligences. As long as you are smart in the classical way and you're left alone, you can probably solve lots of problems. But once you're put into a milieu with other people, especially in an influential position, if you don't have understanding of other people and understanding of yourself, then you're in big trouble. And that was completely ignored by IQ tests. Nobody paid attention to understandings of human nature and of human differences.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate your example because we are in a room full with influences, people who can change other people's minds, and it takes an enormous amount of capacity or skill or to change people's minds. You have been working on the idea of changing minds and how people who are in the position of leadership and the position of big leadership or small leadership, whether you're a mind changer in a school or a mind changer in an organization, a corporation, or a mind changer in government, there are certain things we need to know how to do. And I wonder if you would like to just remind us of what is it that your research shows about what it takes to change people's minds, because this is really, really important, especially as we think about where to move the direction of educational systems like Vietnam, like the Vietnamese, or for that matter others in the world.
Well, I talked about my work on multiple intelligences, and that's what I did 40 years ago. Then, as you know, I became very interested in changing people's minds. And I did a study of that, and I wrote a book called Changing Minds. I would say that it would be a mistake for me to summarize that book now, because I actually don't agree with some of the things in it. First of all, and this may not be what you want to hear, it's much harder to change people's minds than I ever thought it was. It's very difficult. And it's much less a rational process than I thought. When I wrote the book, I talked about using reason and research to change minds. And I now realize that emotions are probably very key to changing people's minds. Also, one thing I did realize when I wrote the book is that the biggest mistake mind changers make, and that includes me, is not understanding the resistances well enough, what it is it takes to change people's minds. I use an example which everybody will know about in 2021. Ever since Donald Trump lost the election, there's been huge evidence that he really lost the election and there was no significant cheating going on. And yet the 47% of American voters who supported him still support him. Their minds have not been changed at all, despite massive, massive evidence. And that's because I don't think the mind changers have figured out enough about why people won't change their minds, what their reluctance is, what makes it very difficult to get rid of what you think and embrace something new. You talk about leaders, which I also studied. This may not be a coincidence. Leaders are people who change the way individuals think or behave and do so voluntarily. If a person is an autocrat or a totalitarian, he can get people change their minds as long as the punishments and rewards are there. But as soon as a Hitler or a Stalin gets demolished, then the people go right back to where they were before. I used to think that the way leaders changed people's minds was through the stories that they told and the lives that they led. So if you think about people who have been admired, people like Gandhi or Martin Luther King Jr. or Nelson Mandela, not only do they have a story about their society, but they also embody it in the kind of lives they lead. And all of them either were killed or risked being killed. Nowadays, and everybody who's in this room knows this, it's very hard to tell what's truth and what's lie, because social media are bombarded with all sorts of stories which aren't true, including stories about leaders who are completely totalitarian. I mean, as I'm speaking, the head of North Korea has claimed there's no deaths for COVID. And as long as people in North Korea don't have access to any other kind of news and the media are very much controlled, then of course they think there's no deaths of COVID, even though you could even tell by looking at the president that he looks totally different than he did 6 months ago. Mm-hmm. So changing minds is very difficult, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try. And I spent all my life with students, with mentors, and giving talks, trying to help people think differently and hopefully better. But I'm not foolish enough to think it's an easy task. And the tendency to regress, to fall back on what you believed before, is very, very powerful. We might take a look at two things in the United States where people have changed their mind over the last 50 years, and that is, women's ability to carry out different kinds of jobs, and the fact that being gay isn't a life choice; it's a biological choice, and it's worth studying how that change took about. I think people who are personalities in the media and who revealed that they were gay, or women who got in positions of power and showed that they could do it well, were very, very important. I'm going to use an example now which will step on some toes in Vietnam, and that is that, China had emperors for 2,000 years, and then Mao came on, and of course he didn't say, I'm the next emperor. He didn't say, this is the Mao regime. And under Deng Xiaoping and some of his successors, there were no imperial aspirations. But if you look at President Xi now and his veneration of Mao, it's going right back to the imperial thing. And it's no different with Putin in Russia. He's a czar. And I'm not going to speak about the Vietnamese situation, but the regression to former imperial or former totalitarian impulses is very, very great and shows that it's not easy to change minds.
Yeah. I think that we live in a time in which that is very visible. And when, as I was listening to you, I noticed that you talked about the role of emotions, in changing people's minds. You talked about the role of thinking better and thinking more broadly, and it brings me to thinking about creativity, which is and the role of creativity, the role of the arts in education today. I see that around the world, given the uncertainties of the world in which we live, creativity has become sort of a real topic of conversation in education, especially in Asia, right? Where educational systems are seeking to move a little bit away from sort of more rote systems of memorization and reproduction of knowledge, which we know has not necessarily yielded the deep thinking and creative thinking that we are hoping to see among young people. So, in your own work, when you think about when we think about creative individuals in sort of more sort of extensive ways, you've studied them. What is the role of creativity? What is the role of the education and the arts, which is something that is very central to the conversation today, in nurturing the human beings that we would like to nurture? But
well, I happen to be very involved in the arts, and I think you are as well. But creativity is not particularly associated with the arts. It's associated with any mental or indeed physical activity. You can either do things just the way people have done it before. You can do it a little bit differently, or you can do it very differently. And as you know, we make the distinction between big C creativity, which are the Einsteins of the world, or the Madame Curies, or the Picassos, or the Frida Kahlos, big C artists, and then what more ordinary people do, the mother or father who puts the child's drawings on the refrigerator. That's fine, but it's not going to be in a museum soon. And with Emily Weinstein, we've actually recently developed the notion of mini creativity, which is the tweet. There probably are tens of millions of tweets sent out every day. I don't tweet, so I don't look at them, but probably one or two of them get noticed, but they get forgotten. And those are mini C creativities. This is where there is a huge fault line between the West and the East. I'm going to say Confucian societies, which is Japan through Indochina, and the West, which is the US, maybe Canada, and Western Europe. In the Renaissance, beginning in the 15th, 16th, 17th century, we began to allow people to imagine whatever they could in artwork and sign it, to do all kinds of scientific experiments and report it. And even though the Pope tried to kill Galileo, he didn't succeed. And to be kind of trite, the West took off. And when the people used to come to see me in my office 40 years ago from China, Japan, they'd say, Dr. Gardner, what are the 14 ways to creativity? And they would have their pencil poised to write them down. And I said, you're already finished if you think it's 14 steps. It doesn't work like that. The best way to become creative is to live in an environment where that's what's accepted and that's what's done. And some people lucky enough to have been born in a creative environment or a household. Some people lucky enough to have gone to a school. I went to pretty good schools and then to a very good school. And you can pick it up from the environment. But if you live in a place where anytime anybody does anything unusual, they get their hands slapped, you're not going to have any creativity. Getting closer to Earth, I don't think students are ever going to be creative in schools unless teachers and parents think it's worthwhile and encourage it. So when I was working many years ago with another psychologist, we decided to take the book report. In every American school in those days, children wrote books and they had to write a book report. The book report was 800 words and what the book's about. And of course, we want the book report to be accurate. But there are many ways to write a book report, just like there are many ways to write a book review or movie review. And we began to open the possibility that you didn't just have to follow a rule. Maybe you don't start the book report with a topic sentence. Maybe you don't always put the discussion of the author last and the discussion of the reservation second to last. And that opens the notion there's more than one way to do things. But if teachers don't believe that, if they don't have that in their DNA, it's never going to happen with the students. And if schools do believe it, but when kids get home, they get their hand slapped or moved to school, it's not going to happen either. I would say that in the late 20th century, the United States was the most creative society in the world, and we're seeing the benefits and the costs of that. And the costs are at least as great as the benefits, because when you discover that the bomb can be split, that's a scientific invention. But when you bomb Nagasaki or Hiroshima, that's not a very nice use of it. And then when you start an arms race, that isn't very good. And similarly, all the people who invented social media said, oh, wonderful, people will be able to express themselves and there'll be free democratic processes. And it's exactly the opposite. It's very, very dangerous. And yet, as I would imagine is the case in Vietnam, when you try to control social media, it doesn't work because people create new ones or they find codes or so on. So creativity is something that I personally value greatly. And I want to live in a society that's creative. And because my recent work has been in higher education, I know that throughout Asia, and this includes Vietnam, that's why you're working with Veronica, people would like to have the young people more creative. But you can't have it if you can say, well, you can raise questions about science and engineering, but you can't raise science about politics or economics or how the society should be. And I'm not saying that I have the answers, but I'm saying you can't put prison walls around creativity and say, it can work here. And let's take genetics. Let's say, okay, we're going to do genetics, but can I do an experiment? Can I cross Veronica with a tiger and see what kind of offspring comes? That's an ethical issue, and you can't sweep that under the rug. Mm-hmm. Or, if a totalitarian leader spreads lies, Donald Trump spread 30,000 lies. Does Facebook and Twitter have the right to say, well, you can't spread that? Mm-hmm. He'd say, you're cutting off my creativity. I would say you're destroying the society. Mm-hmm. But if the big question I'm raising is, do societies allow us to think and talk about everything when they set up boundaries? And if they set up boundaries, who's going to watch the boundaries and police them?
Mm-hmm. Really, really very interesting tension there, Howard, because in a way we're thinking, so for young people having, being exposed to a variety of different, forms of knowing and forms of experiencing the world, whether it is through science and understanding nature, or whether it is through dialogue with others and developing sort of more interpersonal capacities or potential, or whether it is expressing, themselves through the arts and music and dance. And so it seems to me like all of that sort of contributes to an education that really sort of fulfills, the promise of what it means to be a human being, right? And at the same time, we're saying, yes, and creativity is part of this. However, creativity without ethics can be very dangerous. So, and I hear you say that ethics can be either be a matter of, that ethics can be either be a matter of, governments and institutions really sort of offering parameters as to, should we do human cloning or not, and at the same time, I'm imagining that you think that young people need to develop ethical standards themselves, right?
Okay, well, ethics is a big word. It's a word I like to use, but I can tell you 90% of American college students don't know what it is. And I don't even know whether there's a word for it in Vietnamese, but it's basically a sense of responsibility about what you do and how it gets used. I use myself as an example. When I developed the theory of multiple intelligences, I said, great, I got this idea. I think it has validity. It's being talked about a lot. Ha, ha, ha. How wonderful. And then when I realized that it wasn't being used in ways that I thought were good, in fact, it was being used in ways which were pernicious, like classifying whole racial groups in terms of which intelligence they had and which ones they lacked, I said, well, if I don't take responsibility for it, I can't expect anybody else to do so. And, people often start with the arts because that seems to be a less policed field. But in fact, when dictators come in, the first thing they do is to control the arts. They burn the books. And as somebody said, first they burn the books, then they burn the human beings. And what did Madame Mao do? She controlled the visual arts. You cannot say that the arts are immune from being policed, because whenever somebody gets power, if they don't like the way the arts are being used, whether it's theater or movies or paintings or even music, songs, it's hard to have a lyricless piece of music that's too political. March maybe might be the closest. So even people in the arts need to think about the responsibility for what they do. And since artists, and as we pointed out, we love the arts, tend to see further. George Orwell saw 1984 before it happened, and so on. The arts can be a very police-inviting domain. And that doesn't mean at all we shouldn't involve young people in the arts. I think every young person should have the chance to develop at least one art form, whether it's dance or poetry or theater or playing an instrument or painting or caricature. My wife did mosaics with our 5 and 6-year-old grandchildren last week, and mosaics are, putting glass in design like on a window. But I guess you can't run away from responsibility and ethics. And my research group at Project Zero at Harvard is trying to think through what would a whole educational track be, starting with, when kids start school all the way through to when they go out to the world of work. Because ethics and responsibility aren't something that you can just say, well, now I've turned 25 and I'm going to be responsible. Confucian society has been better on the we than on the I, and Socratic societies have been better on the I than on the we, but you need to have both. You need to have the I of creativity and the we of responsibility.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But, Veronica, and I'm interested in what you think about this. When people don't even agree about what the problem is, what the challenge is, it's very difficult.
Yeah.
How do you think about it? You work all around the world and people don't bring the same assumptions to the table. What do you do?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that listening is extremely important. And really, so from my perspective, listening very, very carefully and listening with a great deal of forbearance, as Daniel Allen would say, sort of understanding that the perspectives and worldviews and life experiences may be very, very different. And at the same time, trying to find sort of within these differences, where are our common grounds? Where is it that we agree that we can sort of build from? And that's a slow process. It's not something that can be sort of mandated. Now it's Thursday morning. We are taking the class on listening. I think that it is a matter of creating an environment in which people can, and children from very, very early on, can sort of describe the theories about what's going on in the world around them, whether it is how things work, how nature works, and listening to each other's theories and try to articulate what is common, what is different, what else do we need to know. And I think that as you say, that this is something that we share. I think that we need whole educational systems, from the beginning to the end, able to listen and able to change the minds. In our own work, for example, with a very progressive group in China, we worked on global competence, and our own sort of, that's a great get great part of the work that I do, as you know. And while we were thinking about global competence very much sort of in more cognitive terms initially, and in what, so you need to know how to think about asking questions about the world, you need to how to think about taking perspective with others. One of the things that we notice is that in a Confucian tradition, the idea of harmony between people, the idea of embodying virtues, were ideas that I thought were extremely interesting. So how do we create these hybrid frameworks, these hybrid ways of thinking about education that do not position us in completely antagonistic ways, depending on, where in the world, north, south, east, west, but really sort of enable us to leverage the power of integrating points of view. That's very much the nature of what we're doing right now with Tanburi in Vietnam. We're really trying to understand, how teachers think about their environment in Vietnam. What does it mean to be a globally competent Vietnamese child? We keep asking the question of what will children who will be adults, who knows where around the world in Vietnam or beyond, what is it that they will remember about what it meant to grow up in Ho Chi Minh City when they were children? What do they take away as part of their identity? And in a country that is changing so fast, that is, westernizing in many ways, how to keep that balance of, progress, economic development, but also inclusive and respectful of, or caring for, the contributions that Vietnamese culture in this particular case can propose to the rest of the world. So to me, it's a question of listening. It's not simple.
I think that's very well said, and I'm glad I asked you and put you on the spot, and you were fine. In my work on changing minds, to go back to earlier part of the discussion, I said there's one group where it's a waste of time to change minds, and that's what I call fundamentalists. In English, fundamentalist has the connotation of being a religious person, but I don't mean a religious person. I mean a person with a commitment not to change his or her mind. And there are going to be totalitarians or fundamentalists in every society. And, we can't shoot them, or we shouldn't shoot them. But we sort of have to be able to maneuver around them.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's religious, but you can be a communist atheist who's a fundamentalist, just like you can be an American libertarian who's a fundamentalist. Mm-hmm. It doesn't have to be religious. And as I get older, I want to spend less time with fundamentalists because they're not open to changing their minds. On the other hand, there's one thing I won't change my mind on, and that's the importance of trying to figure out what's true. Once you abandon that, I think it's all over. And that's what we're seeing in the world in 2021, is that truth is now for sale.
Yeah, that's hard to hear statement, but very, very clear one. So let us come back to Howard, to educational settings, right? So the work that you've done with all the way from broadening our sense of of human potential and a sense of what is possible for young people, as well as the work that you have been doing for now decades and on good work, as you call it, good play, good learning, good sort of work that is excellent, that is engaging, that is ethical. When you look around the world into sort of places where you see this shining, sort of this way of thinking about education shining, or there are elements that you really appreciate into how this has been translated into concrete practices, what might be some examples? And could you sort of bring us into those places so that we get a really vivid way? And I'm thinking about this from the perspective of an educational leader who's really trying to support educators to move in this direction. I'm thinking about it from the perspective of a parent who's hoping to create environments at home that would be, that would really instill the best of human potential, the most creative, the opportunities to develop creativity in all of these different ways that you were describing, in the arts and science, in human relations.
Could you make the question any bigger?
Yes, I can add politics to it.
All right, I'm going to just give two very different thoughts here, and probably that would be the last big topic to talk about. As you know well, and I think this is part of what you've brought to Vietnam, is for 40 years I've been very taken by the schools in Reggio Emilia in northern Italy, and in the same tradition, the Montserrat schools in Spain, because I think they have a very healthy balance between a sense of community, of others, of something bigger than yourself, starting very, very early in life, and at the same time, they in Reggio they speak about the 100 languages of children. They appreciated before they ever heard of me that kids can learn in many ways, they can represent the world in many ways, they can express things in many ways, and it's very cruel to suppress that and constrain them. And yet, there are very few schools that avoid that kind of strangulation. Progressive education in the United States, which would be another talk, has tried to do that. And my children all went to progressive schools, and I don't regret that. But I think they've become, as a general point, too self-indulgent and not responsible enough. They've lost the communitarian aspect, which John Dewey believed in the United States, and which Reggio and Montserrat believe in Latin Europe. The other thing will probably surprise you, and it may surprise the listeners, viewers as well. Wendy Fishman and I have just completed a 10-year study of higher education in America. We know more about what's going on in American colleges than just about anybody else. And one of the alarming things was how often young people in America, students, use the word I or me as opposed to we or us. 11 to 1. There are 11 times as many I's and me's as there are we's or us's. And this has led me, I'm not going to speak for Wendy, to the conclusion that American colleges are too laissez-faire, too anything goes, and they don't have a central sense of mission. And as far as I'm concerned, it can be a religious mission. Clearly, the Montserrat schools are very Catholic, and I always used to joke that the Reggio schools were communist Catholics, because Emilia-Romagna is a Catholic part of the world where people are communists and they don't go to church, but they believe in the schools and the community. And I think that a progressive education where minds are allowed to develop freely, combined with a strong sense of mission, and the mission can't just be about me, it's got to be about us. I think that's the formula, if you can use the word formula, but it's got to be infused in the DNA. You can't say, well, the kids have gone to a grinding and Dickensian school for 20 years, and now we're going to give them a fluff of good work. It doesn't work that way. It's got to be built into the DNA of the system. And there are places in the United States and elsewhere, as I think you do. I look at some parts of Canada, Finland, some places in Australia, Netherlands, strands of it, but it's rare. It's not as common as it should be.
Mm-hmm. I'm intrigued by what about you visited the Montserrat schools, and I did as well in Barcelona, and I'm intrigued by what images you have or what conversations you have that stay with you as very, very concrete sort of examples of what happens. So I can give you two that stay on my mind. Sort of one is I remember the leaders of the school, the nuns, came to one of our future of learning institutes and thinking about how do you anticipate as an educator where societies are going so that you can sort of make decisions about what matters most to teach and to learn. And when I visited them, they said, Veronica, every summer we spend some time studying a big issue in the world. Climate change is, the rise of totalitarian, the rise of nationalism, the rise of whatever the topic is. And then we think about where is it that we will just infuse this contemporary and future long-lasting systemic issue in our curriculum, which I think is incredibly powerful as a way of thinking about the world and inviting the world into the school and the school into the world. And so that's one example that I thought was brilliant. And then another example that I think is very doable, which I also saw in the embassy schools that Tan leads, is the use of space. So imagine this stairway that goes all the way from the first floor to the second floor, but then the students had illustrated each one of the steps on the side from the beginning of the prehistory of humankind all the way to the present. So as you would go up the stairs, you had a chance of looking at what did cave art look like at the time in thousands of years ago. So and look at the progression. So you have this sense of the whole humanity every time you go up and down the stairs, right? So it's a really very, very powerful message for kids that they are part of something much, much bigger than themselves, as you were suggesting.
So here's a takeaway. You won't have a learning school unless you have a learning faculty that continues to learn. And you won't have a responsible student body unless you have a faculty that thinks about responsibility beyond themselves as individuals, but about the larger community. Easy to say, and it's certainly been the vision of many educators, I'm sure Confucius among them, but to achieve them it's a mission, it's a calling.
Yeah, a calling for humanity in a way. Yeah. So Howard, thank you so much for your time today. It's just such a pleasure to have been invited by Tan, and we're in such great company with folks from UNESCO, from intellectual leaders and scientists from Vietnam, plus a collection of young people who are really showing us what is possible to do when creativity shines with your bodies, with your minds, with your art, with in dance and science and so forth. What I take away from our conversation today perhaps are sort of three really, really important messages. One is we human beings are very broad and very capacious, and really sort of embracing the whole human being involves embracing not only math and language, but really seeing how we can be intelligent, as you would put it, in our full human potential visually, so and across the disciplines, in the arts, in science. And I also take away your comment about creativity, and creativity paired with ethics. That creativity is extremely important in today's societies, that there's the big creativity, the big C, small c, that we can all be sort of creative and to various degrees, but that it really, really matters that if we're thinking about an educational system that fosters creativity, that we do that from early on, and we do that with ethics intertwined. That this really is important. And also take away sort of the fact that it is possible. We've seen some really good examples, but that the broader societal conditions matter. Whether the political systems, the societal systems, the societal commitments, and that people that we will reach a quality education that fosters creativity if folks who have influence really think that this is valuable, that creativity and ethics are valuable hopes and goals, for the development of our children. So would you agree with that?
Yes, no, a good summary, and I hope that the audience had a very good experience at this meeting, and that at least something that you or I said might have some positive influences on your burgeoning society.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Howard. Thank you so much, and I hope that we both sort of, you join me in congratulating Tan, who today is being recognized as a UNESCO ambassador, for children, and education. So congratulations, Tan, on the part of both of us. And thank you so much, Howard, for your time and for your brilliance. Always a pleasure. Take it. Thank you.